Are we condemned to be selfish? Imagine you found a ring, not a piece of jewelry born of modern design, but an ancient, coarse artifact found in a chasm after an earthquake. You slip it onto your finger, and as you turn the collet inward toward your palm, a sudden chill runs down your spine. You look down, and your hands are gone. You look in the mirror, and the room behind you is empty. You are perfectly, flawlessly invisible. No one can see you, no one can judge you, and no human law can track you down. What is the very first thing that crosses your mind? Be completely honest with yourself. Would you use it to glance at the answer key of an incredibly difficult university exam? Would you walk into the vault of a multinational bank taking just enough to clear your debts? Or would you use this absolute power to play a silent vigilante, stealing from the corrupt to distribute wealth to those in desperate need? In the second book of Plato's Republic, a scholar named Glaucon shares the story of a shepherd named Gyges who found exactly such a ring. Gyges was, by all accounts, a regular, law-abiding citizen, but the moment he realized he held absolute immunity, that he would never face the consequences of his actions, the societal veneer shattered. He sneaked into the royal palace, seduced the queen, conspired with her to murder the king, and seized the entire empire for himself. Plato uses Glaucon to throw a terrifying psychological wrench into our moral machinery. Glaucon argues that if you took two of these rings, gave one to a deeply righteous person and the other to a known scoundrel, both would end up taking the exact same path. The righteous person would not stay on the path of virtue if they knew they could steal, kill, or sabotage without detection. It forces us to ask a question that cuts straight to the bone. If we had absolute certainty that we would never get caught, would any of us actually choose to do the right thing? Intellectual threat. The truth we desperately refuse to face is this: every single time you believe you are acting out of pure kindness, love, or a noble sense of duty, you might simply be obeying a selfish biological mechanism. What if altruism is a myth? What if morality is nothing more than a social disguise, a clever evolutionary toolkit designed to mask our underlying pursuit of pleasure, validation, or security? If this psychological reality is true, then everything you hold sacred: justice, sacrifice, nobility of soul, completely crumbles. It means you aren't actually a good person by choice. It means you are simply a sophisticated social predator who has been housebroken by the fear of prison, social ostracization, or divine judgment. You don't practice justice because you love it. You practice it unwillingly because you lack the power to do injustice with impunity. But don't turn away just yet. Because if we push this unsettling logic to its absolute limit, we discover a fascinating intellectual paradox. This isn't just an ancient riddle to debate in a university hall. It is an active, invisible war happening right now inside our modern world. Two diametrically opposed philosophies are clashing in our courtrooms, our tax codes, our corporate boardrooms, and our political elections. On one side stands the fierce, uncompromising philosophy of ethical egoism, championed by thinkers like Thomas Hobbes and modern iconoclast Ayn Rand. They claim that your personal happiness is the highest, most legitimate moral purpose of your life, and that sacrificing yourself for others is a form of moral rot. On the other side stands utilitarianism, forged by Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. They demand that we throw away our individual egos completely, measuring the good strictly by how much happiness an action brings to the collective, even if it requires sacrificing the innocent. By the time you finish this episode, you will never look at your life choices, your relationships, your career goals, or even the taxes taken out of your paycheck the same way again. We are going to strip away the comfort of everyday assumptions and look directly into the mirror of human nature. Let's dive in. Let's begin by looking into the darkest corner of the mirror: psychological egoism. This isn't a theory about how we should act. It's a descriptive claim about how humans actually operate. It states that every single human action, without exception, is motivated by an ultimate desire for one's own self-interest. Consider the 17th century English philosopher Thomas Hobbes. Writing during the bloody chaos of the English Civil War, Hobbes looked at humanity stripped of its societal constraints. He concluded that human beings are, by nature, completely selfish, aggressive, and fiercely quarrelsome. In our natural state before governments, laws, or police forces existed, we lived in what he called a state of nature. In this state, life was a perpetual war of all against all, making human existence solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. But what about charity? What about when you see someone pull over on a rainy night to help an elderly stranger change a flat tire? Hobbes had a cynical, brilliant answer for that. He argued that opponents of egoism point to noble deeds of charity and altruism to prove we are good. But Hobbes replies that we perform these great acts of charity simply because we delight in demonstrating our own power and superiority. When you help someone who is powerless, you are subconsciously proving to yourself and to the world that you are wealthy, secure, and capable enough to lift them up. It is a display of dominance wrapped in a bow of kindness. If you think Hobbes belongs in a cynical history book, look at modern sociobiology. Scientists like E.O. Wilson have argued that human beings, like all other animals, are genetically programmed to act in ways that maximize their own self-interest. Even altruism, when examined under a biological microscope, is evolutionary math. When a bird screams a warning cry to alert its flock of an approaching hawk, it risks its own life, but it increases the chances of passing on its shared genetic pool to future generations. Under this lens, a parent jumping into a rushing river to save a drowning child isn't an act of transcendent spiritual sacrifice. It is a hardwired, automated biological directive to protect the survival of their own genetic material. But let's take this step further. What happens when we turn this psychological description into a moral command? This brings us to ethical egoism. Ethical egoism doesn't just say we are selfish. It is a normative theory that says we ought to act in our own self-interest. It claims that your highest moral duty is the achievement of your own individual happiness. The ultimate champion of this view in the 20th century was Ayn Rand. Rand looked at the history of the world and saw a terrifying pattern. Totalitarian regimes, cults, and corrupt institutions, all demanding that the individual sacrifice their life, their wealth, and their happiness for the common good. Rand called this an absolute vice. To her, altruism was an ideological poison that turned productive people into victims and recipients into parasitic second-handers who demand things they didn't earn and do not deserve. Rand's morality is built on a single, powerful pillar: the principle of trade. She argued that a truly rational human interact with others not as a servant, nor as a master, but as a trader. You exchange value for value. If you love someone, you invest your time and energy in them because their presence brings immense value to your life. If you work a job, you trade your intellect for a fair salary. In Rand's ideal world, laissez-faire capitalism is the only moral economic system because it is the only one that respects the absolute integrity of the individual. The sole purpose of a government is to protect your individual rights and keep its hands out of your pockets. No forced charity, no welfare state, no safety nets paid for by taxing the productive. If someone cannot earn a living, letting them fall is not malice. It is a respect for the natural order of human effort. It sounds incredibly liberating on paper, doesn't it? A philosophy that tells you it is your moral right to put yourself first, discard unchosen obligations, and pursue your own goals with radical intensity. But if we step away from Rand's idealized view of independent traders, we start to see massive, devastating cracks in the foundation of ethical egoism. The first crack is a psychological trap known as the hedonist paradox. If the ultimate goal of egoism is to maximize your own pleasure and happiness, the funniest thing happens when you actually try to do it. If you spend every waking minute asking yourself, how does this benefit me? How can I get the most pleasure out of this interaction? Happiness completely evaporates. A review of psychological studies worldwide reveals that people who prioritize self-actualization values like inner directedness, deep community involvement, empathy, and genuine friendship are consistently the ones who report the highest levels of long-term life satisfaction and happiness. Happiness is like a cat. If you chase it directly, it runs away from you. It only sits in your lap when you are focused on something else entirely. By making happiness your direct, agonizingly calculated target, ethical egoism becomes completely self-defeating. But the second crack is far more dangerous. Ethical egoism has no objective mechanism for resolving conflicts of interest. Imagine a world of limited resources where two individuals are pursuing their rational self-interest. Let's look at a concrete socio-economic reality: the massive widening gap between the rich and the poor. Since 1980, economic metrics show that the top 10% of income earners now capture roughly 52% of total income, while the bottom 50% own a measly 2% of the collective wealth. An ethical egoist would look at this data and say, the market has spoken. The rich are maximizing their self-interest rationally, and they have no moral obligation to give up a single percent of their wealth to help the bottom 50%. But what happens when the bottom 50, also acting in their own rational self-interest, realize that they have the numbers to band together, tear down the mansions of the top 10, and rewrite the law? If everyone is morally right to pursue their own self-interest, then the billionaire is right to hoard, and the starving crowd is equally right to revolt. Ethical egoism cannot tell us who is right. It can only step back and watch as society devolves right back into Thomas Hobbes' nightmare, a brutal, violent world where the rich assert power over the weak, and the weak use numbers to destroy the rich. It offers no framework for true harmony. It only offers an open invitation to economic warfare. To escape this dead end of hyper-individualism, we have to look at a completely different philosophical revolution that exploded onto the scene during the Industrial Revolution: utilitarianism. As cities grew and factories choked the skies with smoke, philosophers looked at the widespread misery of the working class and realized that individual egoism was tearing the social fabric apart. A brilliant, eccentric English reformer named Jeremy Bentham stepped forward and proposed an entirely new foundation for human morality: the principle of utility. Bentham famously declared that nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. They govern everything we do, say, and think. Therefore, morality shouldn't be about abstract divine laws, and it shouldn't be about Ayn Rand's hyper-isolated individuals. Morality is simple math. An action is morally right if, and only if, it produces the greatest amount of pleasure and minimizes the greatest amount of pain for the largest number of sentient beings. Bentham didn't want this to be a vague emotional concept. He wanted to make morality a hard science. He created an algebraic framework called the utilitarian calculus, a systematic method that takes 7 distinct factors into account to measure the moral value of any action or public policy. 1. Intensity. How strong, sharp, or deep is the pleasure or pain generated? 2. Duration. How long will this pleasure or pain actually last? 3. Certainty. What is the exact probability or likelihood that the pleasure or pain will actually occur? Propinquity. How near or remote is the pleasure in terms of time? Is it immediate, or do we have to wait years to feel it? 5. Fecundity. Will this pleasure lead to even more pleasures down the line? Or will this pain generate a cascading chain of further misery? 6. Purity. What is the chance that the pleasure will not be followed by pain? For example, drinking alcohol brings immediate pleasure, but its purity is low because it brings a hangover later. Extent. How many individual sentient beings are affected by this decision? For Bentham, equality was an absolute requirement of this math. He famously asserted that every individual counts for one and no one counts for more than one. In his calculus, the pleasure of a king or a billionaire has the exact same mathematical weight as the pleasure of a homeless beggar or a factory worker. He even took a radical step for his time, arguing that since animals are capable of suffering, their pain must also be factored into our moral equations. Years later, a student of Bentham named John Stuart Mill realized that Bentham's system had a glaring flaw. By measuring pleasure purely by quantity, Bentham's theory was mocked by critics as a doctrine worthy only of swine. If a pig spending its entire life eating slop and rolling in mud feels more raw quantity of pleasure than a human struggling to write a masterpiece or study physics, does that mean the pig is living a morally superior life? Mill completely reformulated the theory by introducing qualitative utilitarianism. He argued that pleasures are not just different in quantity, they are fundamentally different in quality. He divided pleasures into lower and higher categories. Lower pleasures are basic physical gratifications, eating, sleeping, and procreating. Higher pleasures are intellectual, artistic, creative, and moral. Mill wrote one of the most famous lines in philosophical history to summarize this shift. It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. Even if an intellectual life comes with deep existential burdens, anxieties, and struggles, the quality of that intellectual pleasure is inherently superior to any amount of simple, mindless physical bliss. Because of this powerful framework, utilitarianism became the driving engine behind some of the greatest social advancements in human history. It wasn't just an abstract theory, it was a weapon for social reform. Utilitarians fought passionately for the legalization of labor unions, the total eradication of slavery, the expansion of women's voting rights, the freedom of the press, and the complete dismantling of cruel and unusual capital punishments. It forced societies to step back from rigid religious dogmas and ask a blunt, practical question. Is this law actually helping people live happier lives, or is it just causing unnecessary suffering? So we have traveled down both roads. We have looked through the lens of Ayn Rand, who demands that we protect the sovereign freedom of the individual at all costs. And we have looked through the lens of Bentham and Mill, who demand that we maximize the happiness of the collective, treating everyone as an equal unit in a grand mathematical equation. Both sound like noble attempts to solve the human puzzle. But now, let's bring these two titans face to face and crash them into a terrifying, real-world scenario. Imagine a city tearing itself apart. A horrific, high-profile murder has taken place, inciting widespread racial and social tension. Violent riots are breaking out across every neighborhood. Arsonists are burning down businesses. Looting is rampant, and dozens of innocent citizens are caught in the crossfire, suffering or losing their lives every night. The local police chief is desperate. He knows that if he doesn't catch the killer immediately, the city will implode into a full-scale civil war. But there are zero leads. He has absolutely no idea who did it. Suddenly, a drifter walks into the police station. This man is a social isolate. He has a history of petty crime, no family, no friends, and absolutely no one who will miss him or ask about him. The police chief knows with absolute certainty that this drifter is completely innocent of the murder. But a dark, calculating thought enters the chief's mind. If he frames this innocent drifter, if he fabricates evidence, parades him in front of the cameras, and allows a judge to swiftly sentence him to death, the public will be satisfied. The riots will immediately stop. The burning of neighborhoods will end. Social harmony will be completely restored, saving hundreds of lives and preventing immense suffering. Let's run the utilitarian calculus on this choice. On one side of the scale, you have the intense pain and death of exactly one innocent man. On the other side of the scale, you have the collective peace, safety, and pleasure of hundreds of thousands of citizens who can sleep safely in their beds again. Mathematically, the choice is glaringly obvious. The pleasure of the entire city vastly outweighs the agony of a single individual. According to strict act utilitarian logic, the police chief has an absolute moral obligation to frame and execute that innocent man. It is the good thing to do because it produces the greatest happiness for the greatest number. Are you genuinely prepared to accept that definition of justice? Does it make your stomach turn to think that a society can mathematically validate the slaughter of an innocent person just to buy peace of mind for the collective? If your instinct screams out, "No, that is an abomination, that is not justice," then you are stepping away from utilitarianism. You are moving closer to Ayn Rand's camp, asserting that an individual has an absolute, unalienable right to their life and integrity, and that sacrificing an innocent person for the common good is a grotesque crime, no matter how much happiness it brings to the crowd. But remember the trap on that side of the road, too. If you adopt that hyper-individualist stance, how do you solve the everyday crises of our real world? How do you justify public education, public health initiatives, or infrastructure? If a government cannot tax a wealthy individual against their will to fund a hospital that saves thousands of lives, are you comfortable letting those thousands die in the name of individual liberty? This deep structural tension between individual rights and collective welfare is not a game for a dusty lecture hall. It is the invisible blueprint running your life. It dictates why your country goes to war, how your local community handles homelessness, how wealth is distributed via tax brackets, and even how the ethical programming of self-driving cars and medical AI triage systems is written today. The debate remains wide open, and your mind is going to keep turning this over, wrestling with the mathematics of suffering and the weight of the human soul long after the screen goes black. In our very next episode, we are going to take this exact problem and push it to its absolute psychological extreme. We will analyze the duty-based deontology of Immanuel Kant. We will explore why Kant believed that the consequences of your actions mean absolutely nothing, and why he argued that lying is a moral crime of the cosmic proportions, even if a murderer is standing at your front door demanding to know where your best friend is hiding. Until we cross that bridge, I leave you with the ultimate question. If you held the Ring of Gyges in your palm right now, what would you truly do with your invisibility? Would you remain a defender of the common good, or would you watch your own morality dissolve into the shadows? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I want to see how you balance the calculus against the individual. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss our deep dive into Kant next week. Hit that notification bell so you're alerted the second it drops. And if this exploration forced you to question your own nature, leave a thumbs up. This was Philodern. Take care of your mind, stay rational, and see you very soon.